Hey, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am very well accompanied by a former colleague and friend, Ben Miyamoto. So, Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Happy to. So Ben Miyamoto, I am currently a manager on the Evidence Project at the Pew Charitable Trust, where I help facilitate the Transforming Evidence Funders Network and the Transforming Evidence Network. We're working on how close those names are. So
Cool.
anyways, previously, and what I came here to talk to you about today is more closely related to my previous role, where I was the Director of Chapters, Membership, and Learning at the Scholar Strategy Network.
Very cool. So, Ben, I want to start with something pretty broad in terms of, one of the things that you do is that you try to make sure that the evidence that people produce when they conduct research can inform policy and other important things that we do as a society. So, I want to learn a little bit about what that work looks like and what kind of tools there are out there for us to be able to inform policymaking with research evidence.
Yeah, sure. Happy to chat about that. So, just speaking from my own personal experience first, at the Scholar Strategy Network in a couple of different roles, one of my main jobs was to help researchers share their expertise in the form of policy briefs, op-eds, and other sort of digestible materials. In that role, I probably helped edit 500 to 800 different policy briefs with scholars working across all different issue areas and disciplines. Yeah, learned a lot both about the process of distilling academic findings into sort of actionable bite-sized pieces and about how to use those effectively.
Very cool. Very cool.
So the first resource I'll mention is the Scholar Strategy Network. As a network based in the US, chapter-based local organizations that are meant to help researchers share their expertise. They have a handful of resources on their website, which you might share with the group. But also there are a wide variety of other resources online to help folks distill their writing into more digestible or accessible pieces for lay audiences who don't have in-depth knowledge about whatever you're talking about. So there are a variety of policy brief writing resources on the Scholar Strategy Network website, but also on other places. And then also I would say that op-ed writing courses and training materials are probably good ones to look at because the structure and length, honestly, are both roughly the same and have generally a pretty clear audience, a pretty clear call to action, and follow a similar format because of that.
So I'm curious, how did that work help you with what you're doing now in terms of supporting the use of evidence?
Yeah. So in the Scholar Strategy Network, I was working out of a national office where we were supporting chapter leaders who are mostly volunteers, helping other researchers who are researchers as volunteers, organizing other researchers who are also volunteers to share their expertise. And if you've ever done any volunteer management, which I think you have done a little bit, you know that that could be challenging, and even more so when you're helping volunteers organize volunteers. So in that, we had to be really careful as a staff in helping sort of assess what are the best ways to get our scholars, who are our members, findings used by either policymakers, journalists, other civic organizations, folks like that. Policy briefs are an important sort of tool to help introduce the conversation, but there's a lot of other things. And based on the research about how evidence and research findings actually get used, it's the relationships that really matter, network connections and other things. So I started to ask questions about, what of our efforts, whether writing policy briefs, facilitating trainings, doing sort of targeted networking activities, are actually working to increase the use of those findings from our members in policy or practice spaces. Turns out to be a really hard question to answer, but led me into a sort of space where there are a group of scholars who are building the evidence base about how all that works, which led me into some conversations, which ultimately got me this job, actually.
Very
So,
cool. Very
yeah.
cool. So you're saying that relationships are really important in terms of the use of research evidence.
Yeah, definitely.
Really important. So specifically working with policy briefs, what kind of lessons did you get from that type of work of helping folks develop policy briefs?
Yeah. So I'll start with two things, and we can dive in a little bit deeper if it's useful. But basically, I would start to say that the policy brief or op-ed or really any, I think there's a sort of prescriptive policy brief format, which is really useful for some circumstances. But I think the broader lesson is that there are a lot of short forms that can distill your findings that can be useful in different environments. So speaking sort of generally to that, I'd say whether it's a policy brief, an op-ed, or something else, thinking about that as the start to a conversation with someone that picks up on that relational element, something that you can bring with you to a meeting or to a conference or to something else, as a place to help people understand where you're coming from and what kinds of resources you can offer or what kind of information you're working with, is like the best way to use a brief or other resource. So with that in mind, drafting it with some of those audiences and with that use in mind will be really helpful. The second piece is the structure, right? So you want to get your point across relatively quickly. Generally, we recommended about 1,000 to 900 words, which generally is about a page front and back. That can be a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, depending on the purpose and what you're talking about, and trying to sort of root that in a very concrete real world example or set of examples that can draw an audience in and explain it in simple terms. And ideally, depending on what you're talking about, making it really relevant if you have, as you're drafting, a specific audience or set of audiences in mind, making it as explicit to their context as possible. In some cases, you might want to have a little bit broader of an audience in mind when you're drafting, so you can use it and add that sort of context later on as you're describing it or sort of sharing it with them in person. But I would say that sort of crystallizing the core point of what you want your audience to do is really important. And one addendum there, especially if you're coming from the researcher perspective, I often heard that the audience that people wanted to reach was quote unquote the public, capital T, capital P. And I want to say that group doesn't exist. It is always specific people and specific organizations with a specific role, right? So yeah, in the hundreds of conversations that I had with scholars, I think I was came to be sort of shocked by when I would ask, do you know anyone working at a civic organization, advocacy organization, or policy organization that, should know or like could be informed by your findings? A lot of scholars knew way more people, even if they hadn't been in close contact with them recently, than like I would have expected when they were coming to us for help. So it was mostly us just having to pose the question of like, these kinds of organizations seem like they might use your work. Do you know anyone working there? And have you talked to them about this? So sort of starting with your own network first is a good place to go there.
And always keeping your audience in mind in terms of how you're structuring and developing those sort of short form pieces like an op-ed or a policy brief. Quick question. What is it about that short form, like 2 pages long, that is so important and so much better than essentially handing someone your latest peer-reviewed article?
Yeah. This is true, I think, for basically any written or really any media, right? That everyone is fighting for your attention. Especially true when you're talking about policy or practice decision makers who are often stretched on time, have a lot of different sort of competing responsibilities. If they don't see how this might be relevant to them in the first paragraph, let's say, potentially first couple of sentences, even beyond the first paragraph, it's likely that they're not going to make it through the whole thing. So I would say that then if you have a really good hook at the beginning and a very clear relationship to how this relates to their work, a little bit longer is fine. But I would say that the length of it is very few people are going to read something beyond 3 pages if it's not directly relevant to them. And even if it is, probably not. So that length. And I would say the other piece, distilling your recent peer-reviewed publications into a shorter, more digestible piece is helpful when you're talking to a non-academic audience, because non-academic audiences generally are going to value different things than what your academic peers are going to value, right? So I think that methods can be an important piece to describe in a policy brief occasionally. You'll have to articulate those pieces in a very different way than what you're going to. The depth and sort of specificity of your method section in a peer-reviewed article is critical to getting that assessed by your peers. But most people are not going to care very much at all about how you conducted this study. the only place where I would suggest talking about methods in that context of a policy brief or an op-ed is if it sheds light on the certainty of the information you're presenting, or how you can sort of create bounds around the uncertainty that you're describing. It's sort of complicated without an example, but basically I would say spend as little time as possible on methods. If it can be a critical part of the policy brief, but is a tricky one to convey to a general audience. And then the last thing I would say is that you can hook them with a compelling example or a sort of exciting statistic or something like that. But the key is to get to the point of what does this mean for them, right? And if you don't do that within the first 2 pages, maybe 2.5 pages, then they're going to leave and say that was maybe interesting, and then the next thing is going to drop on their desk, the next meeting is going to happen, and they're not going to sort of remember what is the thing that they had to take from that.
Right. It's kind of like having a bunch of tabs open, and you're less likely to go through the one that's just hard to get through.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay, so tell me about a really memorable policy brief that you worked with.
Yeah, so there are a couple that pop to mind. Some were on issues that related to topics that we frequently got asked about, right? So if they're super relevant to the audiences who are coming to us for information. So we actually had a lot that were trying to deal with administrative burden. So there were a handful of briefs that were talking about sort of describing administrative burden, how to minimize that, which is basically just any cost of transaction cost when you're adding layers of process or other elements. So when
policy makes it really hard for you to access like a public good, right?
Upon a public benefit, if there's like multiple layers of forms and people you have to talk to and sign-offs you have to get, right? That kind of thing. So there were a couple of really good briefs on both sort of describing the problem of administrative burden, and then a few sort of innovative solutions that really targeted their audiences very well, that were sort of targeting state level officials and then some federal officials.
Nice.
Another really memorable brief was on the really specific act in the context of the main legislative session, which was targeting basically how the brief described how supporting low-income single parents in accessing education could help children sort of make their way out of poverty. So that brief is memorable to me because it was drafted in the context of an advocacy campaign that was pushing for a bill that had gotten some general support in the Maine legislature to basically provide, I think it might have been a combination of tax credits and direct benefits to low-income single parents who are trying to access higher education. And as with most folks, the Maine legislature is really sympathetic to issues that are framed around benefiting children, and especially children in poverty. And so linking very directly the benefits or the evidence on access for parents to higher education and improvement in child poverty, or reduction in child poverty rather, was a compelling piece to help basically reinforce the messaging that had come from op-eds and other advocacy campaigns in that current push for the legislation, which ended up passing. Also, part of why it's memorable is that there was like a policy change that happened.
Right, it had an impact.
Exactly.
So in the absence of this policy brief, had this person essentially said, well, you probably may want to read my article, you may not have seen that type of influence over the policy process.
I think that's totally true.
So it can really enhance the impact of the research process.
Totally.
So, and that's my last question, actually. We know a lot of folks that do wonderful research, but we know less of them that go this further step and write a policy brief. Why should researchers go that extra step and write that policy brief? How does it, or any other short form like an op-ed, how should that fit into the broader research process? Why does it matter?
Yeah. So maybe I'll pick up where that last example left off, which is that I think most folks who I know in academia got into it because they care really deeply about the problems that they're studying or aiming to address with their studies. And I think that writing a policy brief or another sort of accessible resource is a great way to increase the chances that you're actually going to have an impact on policy or on practice in your space. Beyond that, I think that those briefs and op-eds also give you access to a world of all different types of informations, right? So taking a meeting with a legislator or a journalist or a civic organization or advocacy organization who's working in your space, I would say that bringing the policy brief along and doing a little bit of pre-work to think about how that audience might receive that information is the sort of precursor or prerequisite step to actually having a like working relationship with them. I'd say another piece that could come along with the policy brief is doing a little bit of sort of background research on what their priorities are, what issues they're working on, what programs they're running. Having a sort of normal human to human interaction with them, caring about their priorities kind of deal. That can give you, and bringing a policy brief along to that conversation can give you access to things that I know researchers care about, interesting data sets, sort of interesting problems that they're working on. So it can help you share findings that might have an impact on their work, but it also might impact the way that you think about the problems that you're studying, right? Where in some cases, it's not actually a lack of access to data that is an issue for decision makers. It's actually the ability to synthesize the existing information that's out there. It is answering really specifically whether or not the data that has been sort of borne out in other circumstances is going to work in their particular context. Getting a sense of all of those things from the people who are actually making the decisions that affect people's lives in the day-to-day, I think is like a really rich way to situate your findings and your research or your future research plans in the real world, right? Where folks are actually having to, make a decision and have an impact.
Very cool. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to link some resources on how to write a good policy brief, how to structure it, and I look forward to questions. Thanks again.
Thanks.